All right. My clock says 9 o'clock. So with that, I'd like to wish everyone good morning. My name is Chad Hoseth. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Provost for International Affairs in the Office of International Programs here at Colorado State University. Good morning. It is my honor to join you for our International Symposium plenary session today on the interconnection between domestic and international diversity. But before we begin our session, I'd like to invite you to reflect on these words and our land acknowledgement. One moment, please.
Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples.
This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native nations.
We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it.
As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed.
CSU is a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion.
And significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon.
This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment.
All right, thank you. Today is a big day for Colorado State. This is the third and final day of our annual International Symposium. We've had 18 sessions, over 50 presenters. All of these sessions have been excellent, including our fabulous keynote discussion yesterday with Lulu Garcia Navarro. Many thanks to all of the speakers and all of the presenters for sharing your wisdom and insight during all of our International Symposium sessions this year. There are still more sessions happening though, so please check out our website if you'd like to join the fun with some more sessions a little later today as well. Let me also acknowledge that large and complex events such as this are truly a team effort. And I'd like to thank my amazing colleagues in the Office of International Programs that helped pull the International Symposium together, both on screen, through marketing, communications, and behind the scenes as well. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Sarah Olson, Kevin Noe, Shauna DeLuca, Tyler Clayton, Chrissy Ewan, Krista Rossier, Mary Swing, Monse Domingo, and especially Diana Galliano, and also Chrisanna Hughes in the Office of Inclusive Excellence for all of your amazing work over these last few days and months. If we were in person, thanks Kathleen, I know we'd all be applauding for them right now too. Today's session is designed as an informal conversation between two of CSU's great leaders, who each have much to say and share on the intersection between international diversity and domestic diversity. I'll be offering up some questions to get conversation started, but I invite you to join the fun. Please share your questions or thoughts in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll work to integrate questions and reflections from you throughout the course of the session today, and we'll get to as much as we can in our short time together. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce Kauline Cipriani, the Vice President for Inclusive Excellence at Colorado State University, and Kathleen Fairfax, the Vice Provost for International Affairs at Colorado State. Good morning. So let me get started by asking you each to share your story. What experiences did you have in your youth? and in your young adult years that impact your perspectives on today's topic. Kauline, let's start with you.
Thanks, Chad. Good morning, and good morning to all of our participants and attendees. Thank you for having me to be a part of this conversation. I very much look forward to continuing this conversation with Kathleen and other folk in our International Programs Office. So just a little bit of background about myself. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a twin island state that is right off of the coast of South America, very, very close to Venezuela. And that's where I spent, my childhood. And when I came to this country many years ago, I came as an international student, and I came to an HBCU. I'm a proud graduate of Prairie View A&M University in Prairie View, Texas. And I've shared with many people that one of the best things that could have happened to me as an international student who is also Black, is coming to this country and going first to an HBCU, where I really felt that I was surrounded. And I'm sorry, HBCU, for those of you who don't know, is historically Black colleges or university. And so I really felt that I was surrounded by love and people who were willing to work with me as an international student, who didn't really understand at first, or had some ideas that mostly came from TV about the context of race relations and socioeconomic class status in the US. So I didn't know that coming here as an undergraduate student. And many of the people who taught me were my peers. I learned a lot about what I needed to know in the dorms. And I know we don't call them dorms anymore, they're residence halls now, I'm sorry. but showing my age. So yeah, so I think I'll end there, and we can talk some more about it later.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Kauline. I think it's very interesting to have a vice president for inclusive excellence who also came here as an international student, because you have a unique perspective on the two worlds. For me, I grew up in a very socially segregated Kentucky. Legal segregation may have ended, but in the 60s and 70s, when I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, it was still quite socially segregated. And I came from a very racist neighborhood, and to some degree of racist extended family. But my mom was very anti-racist and really instilled in me the notion of love for all, and that discrimination in any way is bad. Unfortunately, I lost my mom before I had a chance as an adult to ask her, how did she come to that realization herself? But it really influenced me, so that as I experienced things growing up, including a cross burning in a yard in my neighborhood, it was that racist. I had this both fear and respect for what racism can do to a society. But I didn't really have a lot of personal experience other than seeing it out in the neighborhood. And when I was in college, then I decided to study abroad. And it was coming from a lower middle class or a lower class background with no money in the family. Studying abroad was the first time I'd been out of the country. It was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. And I went to Bogota, Colombia, and saw some of the same kind of racial inequities in Colombia in a different context of people who were a little lighter skinned and people who were more indigenous, and could see it play out there. And before, I thought this is just a US phenomenon. Nowhere else in the world has any kind of racial inequity. And so I was that naive. And it really opened my eye to how complex these issues of both international, I could see all of Colombia and the power disparity between, say, Colombia and the United States. So in one sense, you can lump all of Colombia together, but once you get inside Colombia and you see all sorts of discrimination that happens also based on race, right, I realized then how complex the intersection of these two issues is.
I couldn't agree with you more, Kathleen. I mean, when I think about growing up in Trinidad, there was definitely discrimination. And and they're different, although most of the island is, people who look like me, either Black or brown. So we have a huge sort of population that is descended from Indians from India. And so originally from India. So seeing the discrimination that existed at the places that I went to as a child, which was, school, events, and knowing that people from certain backgrounds, and then there's also a class connection, right? So some of it, and it's hard to know. I was about to say it's hard to know as a child, but it's also still hard to know as an adult, because I would try to have these conversations with my parents. But sometimes individuals didn't want their children associating with us, and it was hard to know whether it was about our color or whether it was about our bank accounts, which were, like your families, very small. My parents worked really hard to give us access to private education, and that was where most, if not all, of the money went. They had 3 girls to educate. We all went to a private school on the island, and that gave us the educational boost that we needed to then continue our studies. We all went to college, and we actually all have advanced degrees, but we're all first generation for every degree that we have. And that was possible through, the hard work of my parents, like many parents across the world, right? But to your point, discrimination absolutely happens. It's global. And but the context of discrimination, and particularly racial discrimination, is unique to the country in which it's happening, right? And it's linked to that country's history. So
I agree.
As you then moved through your careers, especially into the kind of early and middle kind of parts of your careers, how did those earlier experiences begin to influence your perspectives in more of a professional setting?
Yeah, so did you want me to start again, or is it Kathleen's turn?
Go ahead, Pauline, take it away.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Okay, no, Kathleen, you can go ahead.
No, you go first. You're the guest. Come on.
Thank you. I was just gonna say that although my first 4 years when I was an undergrad, I was pretty protected on my HBCU campus, and I was able to learn a lot about what being Black in America really means. I didn't experience the full breadth of that until I got to my historically white institution, which is where I did my graduate work. It was there that I, for the first time, experienced being called the N-word. And listen, I was 20-something years old, right? So in many ways, I was much more prepared for that experience than a kid would be. I had both of my children while I was in grad school, and I paid very close attention to their K-12 experiences because it was so different to mine. I did not go to primary and secondary school here, and I wanted to know what that meant. And they were being raised in West Lafayette, Indiana, where they were a numerical, minority. So getting to see, I would say, how teachers and school systems in general handle issues of racism, power differentials, all of those things I got to see through observing my children move through school. And it was very educational for me, and gave me even greater insight into what all the breadth of undergraduates we have attending our state schools, because most of our undergraduates are US citizens, and most of them come from Colorado. So what they are bringing, their in-classroom experiences, what they bring to our campus really came alive for me as I watched my children matriculate through K-12 and answered some questions that I had as an international student, not having a similar experience in my primary education.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have some similar ideas and perspectives based on the education of my own children as well. for me, after my experience studying abroad, that certainly piqued my interest in understanding things international. I also was first generation, and like I said, I was from Kentucky. It isn't like we sat around at the dinner table and talked international politics. No. So going abroad really opened my eyes to the world in a lot of ways. So I decided to pursue that further, in graduate school, in international relations, Latin American studies. But then I decided to join the Foreign Service with the State Department and become a Foreign Service officer, and had training in Washington, D.C. with the Fulbright program. And I was much more interested in the idea that people need to meet people different from themselves. And that is how true understanding happens, that you got to get away from stereotypes, and you got to get away from all the bias and baggage that comes with those kind of stereotypes. It often results from people just not knowing any better. And so I was involved in the branch of the Foreign Service that deals with international exchange and people-to-people diplomacy, as they call it. And I really strongly became more passionate that this kind of international intercultural exchange between people is really the way to world peace, to put it great big. It is a way to get understanding. And then when I left the Foreign Service, and when I was at Michigan State in East Lansing, Michigan, a similar experience. My youngest started kindergarten, and it was a kindergarten that was only a K-2 school. So it was just for the younger kids, and it was right on campus. And it included all right next to married student housing. And most of married student housing was international students, but there was also quite a bit around the edge of campus of minority domestic students. And so my kindergartner was in class, and I think there were 20 or 25 kids in the class, and she was only like one of two white kids in the class, many international, and her very best friend was an African-American girl. And she was they were just so close and such good friends. And then I remember the day she came home and was crying to me and said she'd gotten this big argument with people at school. Her best friend's name was Michaela. And I said, well, why? And they said, because they said Michaela is Black. And I didn't know exactly how to respond. And you have to understand, my youngest is very artistic, and said, she's not Black, she's brown. And like, it didn't matter whatsoever, but why are they getting the color wrong? Big deal. And I thought, it's because they're in a situation where they really are just interacting with each other as people. And my youngest had a problem with them labeling Black only because the color wasn't quite right. So I think it's those kinds of experiences where you see that the benefit of people interacting with people, especially at a young age, that you see that some of these prejudices can be broken down.
I absolutely agree, Kathleen. And this is why you should go first, because you do better at actually answering Chad's question. So so let me go back to the actual question, which was about moving through my career. I can tell you, as you were talking, I thought about that transition, which was really pivotal to me, from the HBCU as an undergrad to Purdue University as a grad student. And that transition, is rife with a lot of different things anyway, right? Going from an undergraduate student to a graduate student. But what stands out to me and is relevant to this conversation and Chad's question is the notion that I felt really pulled in a lot of different directions as I tried to focus on my graduate studies in ways I did not feel pulled on the HBCU campus. So, and this is where intersectionality, we can talk about intersectionality a little bit, I think, because I feel as though we sometimes forget that people are way more complex than individual identities. Especially the visual ones, right? So in addition to, and I identify as being a Black woman because I have had a Black woman experience in America. People don't know where I'm from many times unless they pick up the vestiges of my accent, which sometimes, is stronger than others. So it's easier for some people to pick up, or, until I open my mouth. So I believe that I have had a very sort of Black experience, and it's an identity that is very important to me, but it's not my only identity. I also identify with being a person from the Caribbean, right? And what that means. And I identify with being a part of the diaspora, right? I joined a bunch of organizations, the Caribbean students, graduate students, the African graduate students, the Black students, but you can't do all of that, and you shouldn't be trying. So being pulled in all those different directions really was the beginning of me thinking about the commonality in our experiences and the importance of recognizing intersectionality even before I started doing, this as work. And also the importance of honoring how people want to show up and us not keeping them or assigning them to a box, which is something that happens across identities far too often on our campuses and in society, if I'm being honest. So.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if, for me anyway, as you move along in your career, you see some of the same themes played out in just different contexts. And that is what I would see within both international and international affairs and exchanges and people-to-people diplomacy, but then the different kinds of currents that run through that, including racial and social inequalities, and how that plays out in an international context, both in terms of who gets the opportunity to study abroad and who does not, and what are the opportunities and what do students learn when they're abroad. And do we think of international students as learning objects for us, as opposed to they're people in their own right who are in this country to get an education, not to educate us? So their role is not to make us more understanding of international. Their role is to get an education, and our role is to support them. But those kinds of understandings, I think, have developed over time. And after seeing it played out in several different universities where it might be a different context, but it's a similar threads that run throughout.
Yeah, it's true, and the same could be said. And I know this focus is on international students and scholars, but I think what you said, we should broadly apply it, right? Just like my role would not be to educate you on the Black experience in America. I can tell you my experience as a Black woman in America, but I think that's true for all the identities. And on campuses that look like ours, unfortunately, on historically white institutions, historically, it has been left up to the individuals who identify with the underrepresented and or underserved, both of those things often come hand in hand, identities to do the educating, to do the work, to do the mentoring, to do the recruiting. I mean, where is the institutional commitment? And that is absolutely changing. It is taking too long to change. But I feel, even in my short time here, that the leaders on this campus recognize that we need to speed up the pace of changing some of these areas, especially if we're going to meet our courageous strategic transformation goals. So
I agree. And I think that I really do think that the field of international education has learned a lot from the field of inclusive excellence and diversity education. Some of the things you just mentioned, that the burden has been placed on the minoritized people to educate and to do all the work to bring up everyone else. It's all, for many years earlier in my career, it was always just assumed that one of the roles of international students is to internationalize your campus. And it's only been following some of the kind of research and advocacy that happened in the diversity world domestically that international educators started taking a step back and thinking that it's not fair and it's not right, it's not ethical to say we're recruiting international students so that they can make us better people. That's not. If we learn about an individual culture from an individual student, that's great if that student wants to share that, but that is not their main purpose being here. And I think that line of reasoning is relatively new in international education and is definitely from learning from the domestic diversity advocacy and scholarship.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Our conversation's already moving into the next topic, which was going to be, hey, Colorado State University. So I'll ask two questions, actually. First is sort of a broad version of the question, and that is, considering your roles at Colorado State, how do you see the work of your divisions advancing intersecting strategic priorities of inclusive excellence and campus internationalization? But Katya asks the question better, so forgive me for glancing at another screen, acknowledging that in her department in the College of Engineering, 80% of their student body are international students, many from India and China. How, again, can our divisions work together in departments kind of participating and working with us to support international students as they experience discrimination, for example, during the pandemic, that they don't have the US context for?
And that's
Kathleen,
yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, it's interesting to think that in some of our departments, and some of them in engineering are a good example, international students are actually the majority in that department at the graduate level, particularly. More international students than there are domestic students, but that doesn't change the experience they have as international visitors, international people on a US campus. And so that difficulty, that experience that they might have in terms of people not being comfortable with difference, not accepting difference, not understanding some of the cultural differences that may actually show up in the classroom in terms of willingness to participate in group discussions, for example, or willingness to question the professor, and what comes from a cultural background and what comes from a place of lack of understanding of what is expected or normal in the United States. And so I think, again, that the research and scholarship and practice and advocacy that has been a long tradition in domestic diversity and in diversity offices is very helpful lens through which to look at international student experience in some of these departments on campus, such as in some of the engineering departments, and looking at it in the sense of what is their lived experience here, letting them have agency to speak for themselves and to talk about what's difficult for them, and having us be able to take a step back and think about, before ascribing motivations or motives to people for actions they may have, take a step back and realize that you're doing that through the lens of whatever your own identity is. If it's a white person, or if it's not a white person, but whatever your identity is, that's the lens you're looking through when you are looking at the behavior of another individual and ascribing motives to them. And that is something that I think, again, that international education has learned from domestic diversity and the advocacy there, that you really have to seriously look at your own lens before you can start to both understand and work jointly and collaboratively with people who are different from you, whether it's racially, whether it's internationally, however they're different. You have to understand yourself and your own biases and lenses before you can really interact fully.
Yep. Yeah, Kathleen, you are now, talking about cultural humility, which is preferred, right, over cultural competence. Cultural humility requires us to commit to really a lifelong journey of self-reflection and critique when it comes to our own individual bias and how we interact with everyone out there, whether they are like us in many different ways or whether they are different from us in many different ways. It also, I would add, this is something that people don't always talk about in terms of the definition of cultural humility, but it also requires us to commit to dismantling institutionalized and structural racism wherever we see it, as well as shift whatever is the power dynamic. And for us, we're now talking about Colorado State University, so I'll be very specific, that exists on our campuses where the difference is a difference in an identity, and the identity of the person who has the least amount of power is often someone who is marginalized, underrepresented, and underserved in some way. So for too long on our US institutions, our underrepresented folk have had the least amount of power, and that shows up daily on our campuses in a lot of different ways, and most troubling in how we make decisions and whose voices we invite into conversations. All of those things have to be changed, and they are starting to change. So that's really good. When I hear, I think it was Katya, you said, Chad's question about 80 or percent or higher numbers of students in departments. My first thought is yes, I do think, and I'm happy to, and Kathleen and I have already had some discussions about how to provide educational conversations and trainings for our international students so that they can understand, they can get a more formal education than the one I got in my residence hall from my peers about, discrimination in the US context. I think that is absolutely important, and I think that is relatively easy done, and I'll work with Kathleen to figure that out. But what is as important, or perhaps even more important, is building an inclusive climate within that department. So it's not only on the international students to learn US history. How do we expect, require, reward our faculty and staff who understand that they will do their jobs better if they understand now how to operate and include all the international students that they now find sitting in their classrooms and working in their labs, towards their graduate degrees. I mean, it's not only, all the onus doesn't lie with the student or the international scholar. If we're, we have to require, and I think actually President McConnell said it very well when she wrote about the courageous strategic transformation, about how inclusive excellence needs to be viewed on this campus. And that is, it infuses everything. So departments that have that high of a number of international students, I think, should be willing to put in the work to ensure that their faculty and staff have access to trainings and conversations about how do we make our academic and workplace environments more inclusive and welcoming, specifically for this group, certainly for everyone, but specifically for the group of international students, because their numbers are so large. Like, that conversation has to be happening too. And we have to meet somewhere, hopefully in the middle.
Kauline, I wonder if you could expand on something a little bit for me. So in the field of international education, we often talk about cultural competence and kind of define it as the ability to understand that cultures have differences and how those differences in language and upbringing and everything else influences behavior, and having an understanding that culture is going to infuse everything. This term of cultural humility, I think, goes a step beyond that. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more. What do you mean by that? And then how might we start to talk about this wider on campus?
Yes, so my career, my background is in microbiology and in health, right? So a lot of how I've come to think about this was developed over reading and having conversations with colleagues about cultural competence versus cultural humility as it applies to the health fields, right? So the human medicine, veterinary medicine, public health. And, not to give you a lecture, but just to give you a quick sort of overview, cultural competence is sort of falling out of fashion, if you would, because when people in the health field think about competencies, they think about, I have to, learn this, demonstrate that I know it, and then I'm competent, checkbox, I move on. This is not how we need to be thinking about DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work. This is a lifelong path. We have, so for instance, here through the Office of Inclusive Excellence with fabulous people leading like Raya V. Hill, we have lots of educational opportunities for our faculty and staff. But what we won't do is say, you have now gone through this cohort, you are culturally competent, check the box, go off, do good work in this area, and be inclusive. No, we recognize that the approach needs to be a lifelong approach that is much more in line with cultural humility. And it's also, you know, in many ways more achievable, because we cannot expect everyone to know, learn, keep up with all the unique qualities and cultural beliefs by, you know, by group, right? That would be an impossible manual. That would be an Encyclopedia Britannica. Again, my age. But you know, it would be a lot of books. It'll be a lot of books. So that shouldn't be the expectation. The expectation is to come into conversations and groups. And if you're a healthcare provider, come into the room with your client or your client owner, if you're a veterinarian, being willing to admit what you don't know, right? And being willing to ask culturally relevant questions, especially as it, you know, it would help the client understand how to better care for themselves, their family member, or their animal. So I have really come to resonate and love the cultural humility context. That's not to say that there aren't things that we shouldn't learn and that are more easily learned, right? Especially if you work with a certain population, you know, you should know details about their culture and their cultural expectations. But the goal is to show up in the world, in any place or any, you know, room that you find yourself, from a cultural humility stance, where you're willing to recognize what you don't know, ask questions in you know, in a respectful in a respectful manner, to help advance whatever is the, whether it's a research project, or whatever it is that you're working on. So cultural humility, I think, is what we want to ultimately pursue, and goes beyond cultural competence, which, let me just end by saying this, is absolutely better than nothing, right? So most of us go through a cultural competence learning phase before we end up at cultural humility. It's not where you start, it's where you graduate to. So.
And cultural humility seems to be a lens or a way of thinking about things that applies equally well if you're talking about domestic diversity situation or analysis, or an international. It's still the culture of the individual, the group, no matter where they come from or what their intersectionality is. It could apply to, like you said, no one has just one identity. There's many identities that people have, and that cultural humility is a way to approach how you deal with the person as a whole person.
Right. Absolutely.
So I have a question to change the conversation a little. By the way, we have about 7 minutes left. So if others want to also throw in some more questions in the Q&A box, now's the time to do it. Here, as we approach the end of our session already, this is going fast. But my questions and Katya's questions sort of led us to focus a bit on the international student experience. I'd like to kind of go back to thinking of the entire campus community, all students, all staff, and all faculty, and give you both an opportunity to reflect on opportunities for our divisions to intersect and interact to advance inclusive excellence across campus. I'm not sure if anyone has thoughts they'd rather jump in right away with that.
Well, one of the things that I thought about, and I've mentioned it to Kauline, we haven't kind of formalized an actual plan for it, is taking advantage of some of the work that we already do in terms of in the Inclusive Excellence Office, including the Campus Climate Survey, and thinking about it through various lenses, including an international lens, in the sense that this is one area, campus climate, that really affects both of our offices a lot and the people that we serve. And so if the campus climate, whether as a whole or in particular in certain areas or departments, is not hospitable to those that are different, whatever that difference is, then it could affect students who are marginalized in the US. It can affect international students, including international students who may be extremely wealthy back home, but are still seen as a minority and may have problems here, and international students who come from a very poor background and are here because of a government scholarship. So there are lots of different ways that the different populations that we work with and that we are trying to support are affected by campus climate. And this could be one area I think that our office could work on together and could think about how to provide the kind of education, training, access that the campus needs, perhaps in some areas and some spots more than others, to make the campus climate as inclusive as possible of all people.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. When I think about, people, I find that I have to constantly remind people, especially those who think that of inclusive excellence work as zero sum, right? Like we have this pie and we're giving out these pieces of the pie, and when the pie is all gone, if I let Kauline and Kathleen give it to people who are marginalized in any way, I won't have any pie left for me. That is not, we really need to help our folk not think about it in those terms. When we help any group, no matter what the group, but obviously now we're talking about international students and scholars, feel as though they are welcome and are wanted and that they belong on this campus, we are helping the climate for everyone. Everyone really does benefit. That being said, we need to approach this from an equity lens, not an equality lens. Everyone doesn't get the same piece of pie, and maybe someone doesn't want pie, even they want cake, and they need cake to be successful. So we do need to look at our separate groups on campus and have conversations and understand what more can we do to help, say, our international students and scholars feel as though they belong and be successful on our campus for as long as they're here, whether it's 4 years or whether it's a career. So we need to have those conversations, and it's important for us to hear directly from the folk. I mean, my experiences are, 30 plus years old, but, every campus that I have been on, I have heard from current, particularly international graduate students, about their experiences. And, I'm sad to say and disappointed to admit that too many of those negative experiences are too similar to the experiences that I had as a graduate school student, 30 years ago. So we need to increase the pace at which we are making change. And I do believe that actually 2022, this year, this time, post-pandemic, post George Floyd's murders, post really so many things that has happened in the past 2 years that have made us, many of us, even more aware of inequities that exist in this country on the basis of identity, and on our campuses on the basis of identity. I think now is the time to really, to use Kathleen's words, take the opportunity to not only have discussions, but put the work in. Let's have some action items and outcomes that we can measure, so that, if my children decide to go to graduate school, they will be having a much different experience than I did. It's time for change.
Absolutely.
Let me interject a question from one of our great alum out in California, Darshan, who we've already touched on courageous strategic transformation a little, but his question is, do we have an institutional strategy that it addresses the distinctions being raised today? Can you talk a little bit about the CST process and how you see that unfolding, particularly with our two divisions?
Would you like to go first on this one, Kauline?
Yeah, sure. I mean, an important part, I'm sorry, I was also looking at the Q&A. Which question are you reading from?
Darshan Shaw's from
okay.
a couple ago.
Okay. Awareness strategy for our students that addresses. Yes. So I think there are things that have been done prior to my arrival, certainly, but there are intersections and needs that have come to light going through as we went through the courageous strategic transformation. And I joined Colorado State last August, so we were kind of 2/3, if not more, of the way through the process. But what has bubbled up to the front, or to the top, right, is the need to really infuse inclusive excellence throughout everything that we do. So that's really important. And I think part of how we would see that being operationalized on campus is more of what I said earlier, which is understanding where the gaps are for international students as well as others, so we can start addressing those gaps. There are lots of equity gaps that have been well documented for US higher education in terms of educational gaps, as well as opportunity gaps, right, for our faculty and staff. What do those gaps look like? I would be interested to know, so that we can immediately start addressing where the gaps are for international students and scholars, and how do we start addressing them? Because again, we won't have an inclusive campus until and unless it is an inclusive campus for everyone.
That is exactly what I would say, Colleen. And I think that putting inclusive excellence as an underpinning principle in every single goal of the courageous strategic transformation is so critical, because it doesn't make it this office's responsibility over here, and just like international is not this responsibility, you know, over here. Inclusive excellence, which includes, if you're inclusive of all identities and all people, including international. And if every single goal we go through on the courageous strategic transformation needs to have that lens and needs to have those principles underpinning everything we do, that is how we're going to ensure that actual change happens. Because if we, for example, have a goal to increase a certain area of research funding, then let's put on our inclusive excellence lens and look at it in terms of increase it for who and increase it how. And how are we including international? How are we including domestic minority? How do we include undergraduates in some of this research? Which undergraduates? It's just a matter of taking a step back and asking some hard questions of every goal that you put forward in a plan from a lens of inclusive excellence.
Right.
All right. Another question asked of Peter: what would a genuinely bilingual or multilingual campus look like? Unlike many of our peers, CSU does not have a foreign language requirement for undergraduate students. Should we have one?
That is a great question. I love it.
I love
this question. One thing that I have not heard people talk about as we talk about CSU becoming an Hispanic serving institution within 5 years. What does that mean for languages? I was a Spanish major, so Spanish is near and dear to my heart. I would love to see us be a bilingual campus. But what does that mean, really, if we don't even require undergraduates to study a second language?
Yeah, I think we need to have the conversation, and I think where we are now with we're on the verge of operationalizing CST, and a big part of that is how do we intentionally become a Hispanic serving, focus on the serving institution. Yeah, we need to have that conversation. I've missed many opportunities to learn Spanish with my Venezuelan cousins when I was growing up, but I'm in Spanish class now, and I don't know how long it will take for me to be fluent. But I do love that question, and some of the conversations that I have had around becoming an HSI is how do we put more resources to have more bilingual documents, to have more bilingual. So we need to be able to access translational services and quickly for everything that we do, right? I would say that that's part of being a truly bilingual campus is having many more of our written and other materials being available in both English and Spanish. That's a start. But we are going to be exploring this intentionally in the Office of Inclusive Excellence. We have been granted funds to have a leadership fellow who will be working with our associate VP, Dr. Shannon Archerbeck-Engel, on looking at how we intentionally become. And this campus needs to be prepared, would be my argument, right? How do we prepare as a campus to become an HSI? Because, if we only look at the numbers, we're going to become one in X number of years, whether we prepare for it or not. But if you want to, inclusive excellence and cultural humility demands that we intentionally prepare. What does that look like? And I think having this conversation about a truly bilingual campus is definitely on the table. So thank you for the question.
I agree.
We've come to the end of our time. It's amazing how fast 50 minutes will
Flew
fly.
by.
I know.
Thank you, Kauline. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to, again, all of the people that made this event happen and to all the great questions. This session was recorded, as all the sessions for International Symposium were. So feel free to kind of visit our website in a couple of weeks to check out all the great conversations we've had over the course of this week. With that, I'll invite everyone to offer their individual applause again for a fabulous conversation and wish everyone well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.